The briefing room fell silent as Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stepped to the front. It was early April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor had shattered America's Pacific Fleet. The war looked hopeless. Japan's military seemed unstoppable, sweeping across Asia and the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. "Gentlemen," Doolittle began, his voice steady despite the audacity of what he was about to propose. "We're going to bomb Tokyo." The pilots exchanged glances. Bomb Tokyo? With what? The nearest American base was thousands of miles away. No fighter had the range, and no bomber could reach Japan and return safely. "We'll be flying B-25 Mitchells," Doolittle continued. "Medium bombers, twin-engine aircraft that were never designed for what we're about to ask them to do." The B-25 Mitchell was a respectable aircraft, but it was designed for land-based operations with proper runways. What Doolittle was proposing seemed insane. They would take off from an aircraft carrier, something the B-25 had never been designed to do. The plane was too heavy, too large, and required too much runway space. "Sir," one pilot raised his hand, "the B-25 needs at least 1,500 feet of runway. A carrier deck is only about 800 feet long." Doolittle smiled grimly. "That's correct, which is why we've been practicing short takeoffs. We'll launch with the carrier at full speed into the wind. It can be done, but there's no margin for error." The room buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone understood the implications. This would be a one-way ticket. After bombing Japan, they would have to fly to China and hope to find friendly territory before running out of fuel. There would be no return to the carrier. "Why the B-25? Another pilot asked. "Why not use dive bombers or torpedo planes?" "Range," Doolittle answered simply. "The B-25 can carry a decent bomb load and has enough fuel capacity to reach Japan and make it to China. Barely. We'll be stripping everything non-essential from the aircraft to save weight." What nobody said aloud was what everyone was thinking. The Japanese would laugh at this plan. Their Zero fighters were the best in the world, fast and maneuverable. Their pilots were veterans with years of combat experience. The B-25 was slow and heavy by comparison, a sitting duck for Japanese interceptors. But this mission wasn't really about destroying Japan's war-making capability. It was about something more important: morale. America needed a victory, any victory, to prove that Japan could be touched, that their homeland wasn't invincible. "When do we leave?" a pilot asked. "Soon," Doolittle replied. "Very soon. We'll train for the next few weeks, practice short takeoffs until we can do them in our sleep. Every man here is a volunteer. This is dangerous, probably the most dangerous mission any of you will ever fly. If you want out, no one will think less of you." Nobody moved. Doolittle nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "Then let's get to work. We're going to show the Japanese that America isn't beaten. Not by a long shot. The B-25 Mitchell wasn't supposed to be a hero. When North American aviation designed it in the late 1930s, they created a solid, reliable medium bomber for the Army Air Corps, named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate for air power. It was meant to attack ground targets from land bases. The aircraft had a wingspan of 67 feet and weighed around 27,000 pounds fully loaded. Two Wright R-2600 Cyclone engines provided the power, each generating 1,700 horsepower. In normal operations, it needed a runway of at least 1,200 feet for takeoff. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of the USS Hornet, watched skeptically as the first B-25 was loaded onto his carrier. "This is madness," he muttered to his executive officer. "These things are too big, too heavy. We're going to lose planes and pilots." But tests had shown it was theoretically possible. In early 1942, two B-25s successfully took off from the USS Hornet during trials. The key was speed, wind, and timing. The carrier would steam at full speed, creating relative wind across the deck. The bomber would start its takeoff roll as far back as possible, engines at maximum power, and hope physics cooperated. Doolittle's men practiced relentlessly at Eglin Field in Florida. They marked out carrier deck dimensions on the runway and practiced short takeoffs again and again. They learned to get the tail up quickly, to feel the exact moment when the aircraft was ready to fly even before it seemed possible. The modifications to the aircraft were extensive. They removed the lower gun turret to save weight. Additional fuel tanks were installed in every available space, including a collapsible rubber bladder in the crawlway. The Norden bomb sight was replaced with a simpler Mark Twain sight, fashioned from 20 cents worth of materials. Each bomber would carry 4 500-pound bombs. 3 were high-explosive demolition bombs, and 1 was an incendiary cluster designed to start fires. The incendiaries were particularly important because Japanese cities, with their wood and paper construction, were vulnerable to fire. The crews trained on how to fly at extremely low altitudes to avoid radar detection. They learned emergency procedures for ditching or crash landing. They studied maps of China, memorizing potential landing sites and escape routes. What do you think the Japanese will do when they see us? One young gunner asked during a training session. His pilot, a veteran named Ted Lawson, considered the question. They'll scramble zeros probably. Try to shoot us down before we can drop our bombs. But here's the thing. They won't expect us. They think they're safe, that America can't reach them. That surprise is our biggest weapon. The Japanese had good reason for confidence. Their early warning radar network and fighter defenses made their home island seem impregnable. American bombers operating from China couldn't reach Tokyo. The nearest American carriers had been pushed back thousands of miles across the Pacific. The B-25 isn't a fighter, Lawson continued. We can't dogfight with zeros, but we're fast enough at low altitude, and we'll have surprise on our side. Get in, drop our bombs, get out. That's the plan? What the Japanese didn't know was that 16 of these impossible bombers were about to prove that nowhere was truly safe. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, studying intelligence reports with growing concern. It was mid-April 1942 and something felt wrong. American carrier activity in the Pacific had increased, but the pattern made no sense. Yamamoto was no fool. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity and had opposed war with the United States, famously predicting he could run wild for 6 months, but making no promises after that. Now those 6 months were nearly up, and the Americans were proving more resilient than expected. Still, Japan's defensive perimeter seemed solid. The home islands remained untouched by war, their cities operating normally while Japanese forces conquered territory across Asia and the Pacific. Admiral, an intelligence officer, approached. Our patrol lines have detected nothing unusual. The American carriers are far to the east, well outside striking range. Yamamoto nodded, but the unease persisted. American submarines had been spotted more frequently. Radio traffic suggested something was being planned, but what? Meanwhile, the USS Hornet steamed westward across the Pacific, escorted by the USS Enterprise and a protective screen of cruisers and destroyers. On Hornet's deck, 16 B-25 Mitchells sat tied down, their wings nearly touching. It was the first time so many medium bombers had ever been carried by a carrier. The crew called them Doolittle's Raiders, though the official designation was less colorful. Every man aboard knew this mission was unprecedented. If it succeeded, it would be a propaganda coup. If it failed, it would be a disaster. How close do we need to get? Captain Mitcher asked Doolittle during a planning session. 400 miles would be ideal, Doolittle replied, spreading maps across the table. That gives us enough fuel to reach China after hitting our targets. Any farther and we start cutting into our safety margin. And if we're spotted, we launch immediately, even if we're 600 miles out. It's riskier, but better than being caught on deck by Japanese bombers. The task force maintained strict radio silence. They refueled at sea, a dangerous operation in rough Pacific waters. Sailors joked nervously about being sitting ducks if Japanese reconnaissance planes found them. The B-25s couldn't be launched quickly in an emergency, and having them on deck made Hornet vulnerable. In Tokyo, Japanese military leaders remained confident. Their intelligence estimated American carriers were at least 2,000 miles away. The idea of land-based bombers attacking from a carrier seemed absurd, even if the Americans tried something desperate. Japan's radar network and fighter squadrons would provide adequate warning. "The Americans are broken," one Japanese general proclaimed at a staff meeting. They hide behind their ocean while we consolidate our victories. They cannot touch the Emperor's sacred homeland. Such confidence was understandable. Japan had achieved stunning victories: Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Their military seemed invincible, their destiny manifest. But on April 18, 1942, reality was about to deliver. A harsh lesson about assumptions and underestimating one's enemy. The trap wasn't being set by the Japanese. It was being set for them, and they had no idea it was coming. The hunters were about to become the hunted. April 18, 1942, began with disaster. At dawn, the USS Enterprise's radar picked up two blips. Japanese patrol boats, small vessels that formed an early warning picket line protecting the home islands. Task Force 16 was still 650 miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned. "Patrol boat spotted!" the lookout's cry echoed across the Hornet. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire, her guns booming across the gray morning sea. The Japanese patrol boat Nito Maru took dire hits, but managed to transmit a warning before sinking. 3 enemy carriers spotted. Admiral William Halsey, commanding from the Enterprise, made the decision immediately. Signal Hornet, launch aircraft. Doolittle received the message at 800 hours, 650 miles. They discussed this scenario. It meant they almost certainly wouldn't have enough fuel to reach safe airfields in China. But there was no choice. If they waited, Japanese bombers would find the task force. "All crews to your aircraft," Doolittle shouted across the carrier deck. "We're going now." The deck became organized chaos. Sailors pulled chocks from wheels and loosened tie-downs. The 16 B-25s were packed so tightly that they had to launch in sequence, no room to maneuver. If one plane crashed on takeoff, it would block all the others. Hornet turned into the wind and increased to maximum speed. The ship's bow rose and fell with the swells, making the already short deck even more challenging. Wind whipped across the flight deck at 40 knots. Doolittle's bomber, number 1, would launch first. He climbed into the cockpit, his crew settling into their positions. The deck officer stood to the left, holding a checkered flag. This was it. No turning back. Lieutenant Henry Miller, Doolittle's co-pilot, ran through the pre-flight checklist. "Engines?" "Full power," Doolittle responded. "Flaps?" "Takeoff position." The deck officer began waving the flag in circles. "Increase power." Doolittle pushed the throttles forward, the right engines roaring. The bomber strained against its brakes, wanting to move. The deck officer watched the ship's bow, timing the launch. As the bow began rising on a swell, he dropped the flag forward. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 lurched forward, accelerating down the deck. 400 feet. 500. The bow was falling now, deck angling downward. 600 feet. The aircraft felt sluggish, heavy with fuel and bombs. 700 feet. The bow dropped into a trough. For a sickening moment, Doolittle thought they wouldn't make it. Then he felt it, that subtle change in the controls. The wings had enough lift. He pulled back on the yoke. The B-25 staggered into the air, clearing the bow with feet to spare. The aircraft dropped toward the waves before clawing for altitude. They were airborne. Behind him, 15 more bombers prepared to launch. Each pilot had watched Doolittle's takeoff. Each one knew their turn was coming. The deck crew worked with practiced efficiency, positioning aircraft, signaling pilots, launching them into history. In 15 minutes, all 16 bombers were airborne, circling as they formed up. Doolittle waggled his wings and turned west toward Japan. The crews were committed now. Whatever happened next, they were going to bomb Tokyo. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but their world was about to change. At 12:15 hours, Corporal Takeshi Maeda was eating lunch at his radar station outside Tokyo when he noticed unusual blips on his screen. Multiple contacts flying low over the water, approaching from the east. "Probably our own planes returning," his supervisor said dismissively. "The American carriers are 1,000 miles away." But Corporal Maida wasn't so sure. The contacts were flying unusually low. Still, he'd been trained not to cause false alarms. He watched and said nothing. Aboard the lead B-25, Doolittle and his crew stared at the Japanese coastline emerging from the haze. They'd flown for 4 hours at wave-top height, conserving fuel and avoiding radar detection. Now Japan lay before them, impossibly close. "I can't believe we made it this far," Miller said quietly. Below them, Japanese civilians went about their Saturday routines. Children played in parks, people shopped in markets. The war seemed distant, something happening in far-off China and the Pacific Islands. Tokyo felt safe, protected by thousands of miles of ocean. Doolittle's bomber climbed to 1,500 feet for the bombing run. His target was a factory complex in northern Tokyo. Through the bombardier's window, the city spread out in clear detail. Wooden buildings, narrow streets, military installations. "Target in sight," the bombardier called. Bomb bay doors opening. In Tokyo's streets, people looked up curiously at the unfamiliar aircraft. Some waved, thinking they were Japanese planes. The air raid sirens remained silent. No fighters scrambled to intercept. Bombs away. 4 500-pound bombs tumbled from the B-25's belly. Doolittle banked hard right, heading for the coast. Behind him, explosions erupted across the factory complex. Black smoke began rising into the clear spring sky. Now the sirens began wailing. The second B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Travis Hoover, hit targets in northern Tokyo. The third bomber, with Lieutenant Robert Gray at the controls, struck an oil refinery. One after another, the raiders came in at low altitude, dropped their bombs, and raced for the coast. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber approached Tokyo Bay at rooftop height. "There!" his bombardier shouted. "Industrial targets along the waterfront." Japanese soldiers finally opened fire with anti-aircraft guns, but the bombers were too low and fast. Tracers arced wildly into the sky. Zero fighters began scrambling from nearby airfields, but the raiders were already leaving. Captain David Jones's bomber struck the Yokosuka Naval Station. The incendiary cluster bombs started fires that would burn for hours. Lieutenant Richard Joyce hit a steel mill and manufacturing plant. The Japanese pilots who managed to get airborne searched frantically for the attackers. But the B-25s were already racing westward at treetop level, disappearing over the mountains toward China. The Zeros, flying high and expecting to find enemy bombers at altitude, missed them completely. In just 30 seconds over their targets, Doolittle's raiders had accomplished what seemed impossible. They'd struck the heart of the Japanese Empire. The physical damage was modest, but the psychological impact was enormous. Emperor Hirohito had been assured his capital was invulnerable. Military leaders had promised the Americans couldn't reach Japan. Now bombs had fallen on Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The Japanese people, shocked and confused, demanded answers. Their military leaders had no good ones to give, and the worst was yet to come. Because this raid would set in motion events that would lead to Japan's greatest naval defeat. Lieutenant Ted Lawson fought with the controls as his B-25 struggled westward over the East China Sea. Fuel gauges showed near empty. Darkness had fallen, and through the windscreen he could see nothing but blackness. No lights, no landmarks, nothing. "We're not going to make it," his co-pilot stated the obvious. Lawson had known this since launch. 650 miles instead of 400 meant they were burning fuel they needed for reaching China. Now, hours after bombing Tokyo, the mathematics had caught up with them. "Prepare for water landing," Lawson ordered. "Everyone brace." The B-25 hit the surf at 120 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, throwing crew members into the cold water. Lawson was severely injured, his leg nearly severed. Somehow the crew made it to shore, but they were far from safe. Of the 16 B-25s that launched from Hornet, none reached their intended airfields in China. Weather had closed in, and the Chinese airfields, unaware of the raid's timing due to radio silence, hadn't turned on their navigation lights. 11 crews crash-landed or bailed out over China. Doolittle himself parachuted into a rice paddy, unhurt but convinced he'd be court-martialed for losing all 16 aircraft. 4 planes made it to the Soviet Union, where crews were interned. 1 bomber landed in Japanese-occupied China. The crew of that bomber, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, faced a horrific fate. Captured by Japanese forces, they were tortured and tried as war criminals. 3 were executed by firing squad. 8 other raiders, captured after crash landing in occupied territory, faced similar treatment. Sergeant Jacob de Shazer spent 40 months in Japanese prisoner of war camps, enduring starvation and torture. Lieutenant George Barr was beaten so severely he suffered permanent injuries. The Japanese wanted to make examples of these men who dared attack the homeland, but 69 of the 80 raiders survived, rescued by Chinese villagers and resistance fighters who risked their own lives to help. These brave Chinese paid dearly for their assistance. The Japanese military launched the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign in retaliation, massacring an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians suspected of helping the American airmen. Back in the United States, news of the raid electrified the nation. President Roosevelt, asked where the bombers came from, quipped, "Shangri-La, a fictional Himalayan paradise." The American public didn't care about the details. They only knew that America had struck back. In Japan, the reaction was fury mixed with fear. How had American bombers reached Tokyo? Where did they come from? Could they come again? Admiral Yamamoto absorbed the reports with growing alarm. He understood the strategic implications immediately. The Emperor's safety had been compromised. The sacred homeland was vulnerable. This could not stand. "We must draw out the American carriers and destroy them," Yamamoto told his staff. "We will attack Midway Island. The Americans will have to defend it, and when they do, we will annihilate their fleet." The Doolittle raid had done more than boost American morale. It had provoked Japan into a battle they weren't ready for. Yamamoto, stung by the embarrassment of American bombers over Tokyo, would push for an operation that would change the course of the Pacific War. The B-25s had delivered their bombs. Now they would deliver something far more devastating: overconfidence and strategic error. Emperor Hirohito rarely showed emotion in public, but the bombing of Tokyo had shaken him profoundly. For the first time since the war began, doubt crept into his mind. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, what else could they do? "The people are frightened," his advisor reported. They asked questions. How did this happen? Where were our defenses? Can the Americans come again? These questions echoed through Japan's military leadership. The Doolittle raid had caused minimal physical damage, fewer than 100 casualties and some destroyed buildings. But the psychological wound cut deep. Japan's aura of invincibility had been shattered. Admiral Yamamoto paced his cabin aboard the Yamato. The raid had vindicated his warnings about American resilience, but now he faced pressure from all sides. The Army blamed the Navy for allowing carriers to approach Japan. The Navy blamed Army air defenses for failing to stop the bombers. The Emperor wanted assurances this would never happen again. "Midway," Yamamoto declared to his planning staff. "We take Midway Island and we destroy the American carriers. It is the only way to secure our perimeter and protect the homeland." His plan was ambitious, a massive operation involving nearly every capital ship in the combined fleet. Midway, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, would be the bait. The Americans would have to defend it. When they did, Japan's superior force would annihilate them. But the plan had a critical flaw born of overconfidence. Yamamoto assumed the Americans would react slowly and predictably. He assumed Japanese forces remained superior in every way. He assumed the element of surprise belonged to Japan. He was wrong on all counts. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received decrypted intelligence about Japanese plans. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval codes, giving Nimitz unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. He knew about Midway weeks before the attack. "They're coming with everything," his intelligence officer reported. "4 carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. It's their entire mobile force." Nimitz studied the map. The Japanese had more ships and more aircraft. On paper, this should be a Japanese victory. But Nimitz had advantages Yamamoto didn't know about: foreknowledge, determination, and pilots who'd learned from early defeats. And he had something else: motivation. The Doolittle raid had electrified American morale, but it had also revealed Japan's vulnerability. If medium bombers could reach Tokyo from a carrier, what could a concentrated carrier strike do? Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, a dive bomber squadron leader aboard USS Enterprise, studied reconnaissance photos of Japanese carriers. These were the ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. "Now America would get revenge. The B-25s showed us it could be done," McCluskey told his pilots. "They proved Japan isn't invincible. Now it's our turn. We're going to find their carriers, and we're going to sink them." The pilots nodded grimly. Many had friends who died at Pearl Harbor. Some had flown during the Doolittle raid's coordination, providing air cover for the task force. They'd seen the B-25s launch on what seemed a suicide mission. "If those guys in medium bombers could hit Tokyo," one pilot said, "we can damn sure sink some carriers." The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Japan's fleet sailed east, confident and powerful. America's carriers sailed west, outnumbered but determined. Neither side knew that the Doolittle raid had already determined the outcome. June 4, 1942, dawned clear and beautiful over the Pacific. The Japanese carrier fleet, 4 massive flat tops carrying the most experienced naval aviators in the world, approached Midway Island. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Now he would finish what he started. "Launch the first strike against Midway," Nagumo ordered at 0430 hours. 108 aircraft roared off the carrier decks, 0 fighters. Val-dive bombers and Kate torpedo planes. They would soften up Midway's defenses before the invasion force landed. It seemed routine, almost easy. But 90 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers lurked: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. They'd been waiting, positioned by Nimitz's intelligence advantage. The Japanese had no idea they were there. At 0552 hours, a PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted the Japanese carriers. The report crackled over the radio: "Enemy carriers, bearing 320, distance 180 miles. Launch all aircraft," Admiral Raymond Spruance ordered from Enterprise. "This is what we came for." The American strike force was a chaotic mix: torpedo squadrons, dive bombers, and fighters, all launching as fast as possible. Coordination was impossible. The different squadrons would attack separately, not together. It looked like a disaster in the making. Meanwhile, Nagumo faced a decision. The strike against Midway had encountered heavier resistance than expected. His planes needed to rearm with different ordnance. But reports were coming in about American ships nearby. Were there carriers? He wasn't sure. "Rearm the reserve aircraft with anti-ship torpedoes," Nagumo ordered. Then minutes later, "No, wait. Rearm with bombs for land targets." The indecision was costly. Japanese carriers began the dangerous process of swapping weapons on armed aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered on deck. Fuel lines remained connected. The carriers were floating ammunition dumps. At 0920 hours, the first American attack arrived: Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They came in low and slow against the Japanese fleet. Zeros swarmed them like angry hornets. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. One by one, the Devastators fell, burning and exploding. Waldron's entire squadron was wiped out in minutes. Only one man survived. 2 more torpedo squadrons attacked and were nearly annihilated. The Japanese pilots laughed grimly. The Americans were brave, but their tactics were suicidal. Not a single torpedo hit home, but those torpedo attacks pulled Japanese fighters down to wave-top height. High above, unnoticed in the chaos, American dive bombers arrived: Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's squadron from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's squadron from Yorktown. At 10:20 hours, McCluskey saw them. 3 Japanese carriers in a neat formation below, their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft. It was a dive bomber pilot's dream. Attack! McCluskey called, pushing his Dauntless into a steep dive. 37 dive bombers plummeted from 15,000 feet. The Japanese, still focused on the torpedo bombers, never saw them coming. There was no warning, no time to react. The first bombs hit the carrier Akagi. Explosions ripped through the deck. Armed aircraft and stacked ordnance detonated in a chain reaction. Fires spread instantly. The carrier Kaga took multiple hits. Her deck erupted in flames. Soryu, the 3rd carrier, suffered devastating strikes. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were transformed from powerful warships into burning wrecks. Admiral Nagumo stared in horror as his flagship Akagi burned. The carrier was doomed, fires raging out of control. Around him, staff officers stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. 3 carriers. In 6 minutes. Impossible. But it had happened. The same carriers that bombed Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific unopposed for 6 months, now lay burning and helpless. The tables had turned with brutal suddenness. "Transfer the flag to the cruiser Negara," Nagumo ordered quietly. He had 1 carrier left, Hiryu, which had been separated from the other 3. Maybe she could salvage something from this disaster. Hiryu launched an immediate counterstrike. Her pilots found the USS Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier took severe damage but refused to sink. Her crew fought fires and stabilized the flooding. She might survive. But America still had 2 undamaged carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They quickly located Hiryu and launched another strike. At 1700 hours, American dive bombers found the last Japanese carrier and plastered her with bombs. Hiryu joined her sisters in flaming death. All 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were sinking. The pilots who had laughed at the B-25 raid, who had mocked American capabilities, who had felt invincible, those pilots were dead or swimming in the Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, one of Japan's finest pilots, died in the attack on Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa, another ace who'd survived dozens of combat missions, went down with Soryu. The experienced aviators who had made Japan's carrier force so deadly were gone. In the water, Japanese sailors clung to debris and watched their ships burn. Some had been aboard their carriers for years. They'd participated in victories across the Pacific. Now they faced defeat and death. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, commanding officer of Soryu, chose to go down with his ship. He tied himself to the anchor so he couldn't be rescued, a final act of samurai tradition. As the carrier slipped beneath the waves, he took Japan's confidence with him. The Battle of Midway wasn't over. Fighting continued another day, but the outcome was decided. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men. More importantly, they'd lost their most experienced pilots and maintenance crews, losses that could never be replaced. Admiral Yamamoto received the reports aboard Yamato. He was hundreds of miles away, unable to intervene. He'd planned a decisive victory that would end American naval power in the Pacific. Instead, he delivered Japan's first major defeat. How did this happen? An officer asked. Yamamoto knew. Overconfidence, underestimating the enemy. The same mistakes that led to Pearl Harbor's tactical success had now caused strategic disaster. And it had all started with those B-25s over Tokyo. The Doolittle raid had accomplished exactly what it intended. It provoked Japan into a battle they weren't ready for. Yamamoto's fury over American bombers reaching Tokyo had pushed him into attacking Midway prematurely. The Emperor's anxiety about homeland defense had created pressure for a quick, decisive victory. That pressure had led directly to this disaster. Back in the United States, news of Midway's victory arrived as Americans were still celebrating the Doolittle raid. The 1-2 punch, first the audacious bombing of Tokyo, then the crushing victory at Midway, marked the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese had laughed at the B-25s. Now they would spend the rest of the war regretting it. James Doolittle expected court-martial when he returned to the United States. He'd lost all 16 aircraft. 3 men were dead, 8 were prisoners, and the rest were scattered across China. By any objective measure, it seemed like failure. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. "You did more for American morale than anyone else in this war," President Roosevelt told him at the White House ceremony. "You showed us we could hit back. You showed the Japanese they weren't invincible." Roosevelt was right, but the raid's impact went far beyond morale. It had fundamentally changed the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. In Tokyo, Japanese military leaders instituted a comprehensive review of homeland defenses. More fighters were kept in reserve. Radar networks expanded. Industrial targets were dispersed and fortified. All of these efforts pulled resources away from offensive operations. More critically, the raid convinced Japanese leadership they needed a defensive perimeter strong enough to prevent future carrier attacks. This drove the Midway operation, which ended in catastrophic defeat. After Midway, Japan never regained the strategic initiative. The Chinese civilians who helped the raiders paid the highest price. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign killed an estimated 250,000 people in retaliation. Entire villages were destroyed. It was one of the war's forgotten atrocities, a brutal reminder that military operations have consequences far beyond their immediate targets. The raiders themselves became heroes. Those who survived the war, 69 of the original 80, were celebrated for the rest of their lives. They held annual reunions, toasting absent friends with bottles of cognac from the mission year. The last survivor, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, died in 2019 at age 103. Ted Lawson, who lost his leg in the water landing, wrote a book called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that became a best-selling account of the raid. Jacob DeShazer, who survived Japanese captivity, later returned to Japan as a missionary, dedicating his life to forgiveness and reconciliation. The B-25 Mitchell itself went on to serve with distinction throughout the war. Over 10,000 were built. They flew in every theater: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, China. They performed every mission from level bombing to ground attack to submarine hunting. The aircraft that seemed too heavy, too slow, too vulnerable proved to be one of the war's most versatile bombers. But the greatest legacy was psychological. The Doolittle raid proved that audacity could overcome material disadvantage. It showed that careful planning and brave execution could achieve the impossible. It demonstrated that America, shocked and bloodied by Pearl Harbor, still possessed the will to fight, and it taught Japan a lesson they never forgot. Nowhere was safe. The homeland that they'd assumed was protected by thousands of miles of ocean could be reached. The emperor, who they'd been told was sacred and untouchable, had bombs fall within miles of his palace. When the war ended in August 1945, it was B-29 superfortresses that carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the path to that moment began with 16 B-25 Mitchells launching from an aircraft carrier on an impossible mission. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the B-25s. They were slow, they said, heavy, vulnerable, not real threats, until all their ships were destroyed, until their most experienced pilots were dead, until their war was lost. The joke, in the end, was on them.